I bid welcome to all of you, Adam's faithful, to this sermon with a twist. Many years ago, I endeavored to take a look at things from Fallout and tease out their real-world inspirations, and I started with one of my favorite things, airplanes. Well, here we are. Fallout 76 came out, and I have the means and time to give the subject the attention it deserves. So I'm going to do the first in what may be a continual effort to remaster my old content. Give me feedback and let me know in the comments if you like this. That said though, we have a long video, because one thing I did get better at is making very long content, where I drone on about crap that only real Fallout nerds care about. I also have a comment highlight section at the end of my video where I go through the comments on my previous videos and highlight the ones that I find interesting or funny, so stick around and give me some good comments to react to. So, turn up the rads and let's get had by the Aircraft of Fallout Remastered. Before I begin though, I just want to scroll down and see who my first commenter was on my very first video. I had 0 subscribers, so whoever this guy was must be a freaking nerd. Let's see. Who is this? Huh? Oh. What the Yeah, sorry, I can't figure out who this is, but I hope he's doing swell. It would be wrong of me to not start a video on the Aircraft of Fallout and not start with the most iconic of them all, the Vertibird. Although it was absent in the very first Fallout, it has managed to be in every main entry since Fallout 2, being absent in Tactics and Fallout Brotherhood of Steel. Like many things that span all the main titles, its history is a bit complicated. The earliest documented use of vertibirds was in 2072, 5 years before the Great War, where they were used to pursue Shanghai Sally, one of the pre-war's most notorious spies. Hornwright Industries, a mining company in Appalachia, had a CEO with connections to the Department of Defense and started cooking up plans to use vertibirds to make mining operations faster and more effective. One vertibird variant, known as the XVB-02, was in the prototype stage before the Great War, as told by a plaque at the Museum of Technology in Fallout 3, and was slated to enter service in 2085. This plaque is accompanied by a scaled model of the prototype, which looks exactly like the vertibirds seen in Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas, confirming that the model used by the Enclave in Fallout 3 and by the remnants in New Vegas is the XVB-02. This model of vertibird can be seen in the Operation Anchorage DLC, but I am hesitant to say that this confirms the use of the XVB-02 before the war due to the unreliability of the simulation. However, there is a poster that can be seen in Fallout 76 that seems to prove that this model of vertibird was used in Anchorage. This poster shows 2 vertibirds that are high up enough that they are small and without much detail. However, it's obvious that the vertibirds seem to be missing horizontal stabilizers, and if we look at the different vertibird designs, the XVB-02 has very small stabilizers that are angled to be even less visible, in contrast to the large, perpendicular, horizontal stabilizers of other designs. So this would seem to indicate that the new prototype version was indeed used in Anchorage. The vertibird would go on in the post-war era to be used by the Enclave very extensively, but depending on the game, we see different versions. The events of Fallout 76 take place right after the Great War, and the version of vertibird that is seen in Fallout 76 are of this design. An intact specimen of this version can be seen on top of the White Springs building, and since White Springs was used exclusively by the Enclave, it is reasonable to assume that the Appalachian Enclave were using this version of vertibird. This version is not the same as the model that is seen in the Museum of Technology that was labeled as the XVB-02, and is likely the very first version of all vertibirds that was reportedly used in 2072. The name of the very first version is unknown, but we will be seeing it a little later on. The next time we see any kind of vertibird is in Fallout 2, where it is used only by the Enclave. It once again looks very different from the vertibirds seen in Appalachia and the model that is in the Museum of History. These vertibirds are not as bulky as the first version that is seen in Fallout 76, although it is quite large and has 7 blade rotors and 6 independent pieces of landing gear that may indicate that it was meant to transport heavy loads. This version is only ever seen in Fallout 2, but is not the only version we see on the West Coast. The XVB-02 model, first mentioned in the Museum of Technology, is seen in Fallout New Vegas in the Remnant's bunker, where a lot of old Enclave equipment has been sequestered when the Enclave members hung up their power armor for good. This means the Enclave had the version seen in Fallout 2 and the XVB-02 on the west coast. And this could make sense. The XVB-02 is smaller than the version in Fallout 2, with smaller 4-blade rotors and forward-facing weaponry. It could represent a smaller attack craft, as opposed to the larger Fallout 2 version that does not appear to have any sort of weaponry on it. It would make sense that the Fallout 2 version is a transport-only variant, developed by the Enclave and used simultaneously with the armed and dangerous XVB-02 model. When we see the Enclave storm the Capital Wasteland, they exclusively use the XVB-02, and we don't see any other variant. It's difficult to say why we only see this version if the Enclave supposedly had both versions on the West Coast. Did the Enclave bring these Vertibirds with them from the West Coast? That long journey would be greatly reduced by flying craft, but if that were the case, I would expect to see both versions, rather than only one. Alternatively, they could have arrived at the Capital Wasteland and commandeered a fleet of Vertibirds that were already waiting either at Raven Rock or other military installations. The only problem with that though is that Fallout 76 seems to imply that the East Coast only had the older first version, since that's all we see in Fallout 76 and Fallout 4, although it is possible that XVB-02 versions existed in limited numbers around DC. The saga continues, since Fallout 4 shows the Brotherhood used the same version that is seen in Fallout 76, the version that we have deduced to be the very first model. This isn't actually that strange, since it is reasonable to assume that there are more early versions laying around that the Brotherhood can either fix or outright copy and build new ones. I do think it's important to state that this somewhat confusing history started in Fallout 3, because up to the release of Fallout 3, Vertibirds were the sole property of the Enclave, and most assumed that meant that the Enclave developed the crafts entirely. I think that is a reasonable assumption, but the Museum of Technology proved that Vertibirds were pre-war in origin and gave us modified forms of the Vertibird that now have to be fit into the game's existing canon. So let's take a look at the Fallout 2 version, since that is the very first one fans came to know and love. As I stated previously in my original video, it has design elements that are similar to dragonflies. The 6 pieces of landing gear are like the 6 legs, the large overhanging wings are positioned similar to a dragonfly, the tail is long and skinny, and the cockpit area is shaped like the head of a dragonfly, with a prominent bulbous design and 2 large eye-looking things on either side. Obviously, the design of the Vertibird was meant to be original, but the concept is similar to some real-world aircraft. The Fallout 2 version appears to not just be a tilt rotor. That is to say that the engines aren't the only part of the craft that will rotate. The entire wing would probably rotate. And I say this just because if they didn't, then the wings would be perpendicular to forward movement, and that would cause a lot of drag, unless they rotated with the engines. So this tilt wing design instead of a tilt rotor would actually make it less like an Osprey, which has a fixed wing design and is only a tilt rotor, and a design more like the X-18. Interestingly, tilt wing designs are better at transitioning from vertical to horizontal flying, and there's less force pushing down on the wings from the rotors. The Fallout 3 version is still a tilt wing design, however we can see prominent forward-facing armaments and what appears to be an articulating Gatling gun, similar to modern-day gunships. The potential armaments of this model are a laser Gatling, rockets, and even mini-nuke bombs that can be dropped. This version is notably missing all the glass present on the Fallout 2 version, instead opting for slits that severely limit the field of view. This would bolster the interpretation that this version of Vertibird is an assault variant, replacing the glass canopy with metal armor. It would also be reasonable to assume that Vertibirds are outfitted with very capable sensors and instruments to allow the pilots to safely and effectively fly with such a limited field of view. Some of the aircraft we will look at later are fully automated, so it is possible that the XBV-02 versions had a certain amount of automated flying as well, which would take the burden of landing and taking off with almost zero visibility off of the pilots. We know of 2 notable unique variants of this version. The first one is called Prydwen. The Brotherhood was able to recover an Enclave Vertibird at some point, and using the large amount of technology they recovered after defeating the Enclave at Project Purity, were able to make it operational. It has a Brotherhood logo emblazoned on the side and will assist the player in the Broken Steel add-on, where the player gets extracted from the airbase when an orbital strike is called on the mobile base crawler. This is the only chance we get to see the interior of the XBV-02 Vertibirds, which is surprisingly spacious, seating 6 people very comfortably, and could reasonably carry a bunch of combat gear or supplies as well. I want to save my thoughts on the interior though after talking about the only other unique XVB-02 Vertibird, and that is Bear Force 1 in Fallout New Vegas. Other than being an awesome pun, this Vertibird is used to transport the NCR president from place to place, although we have no backstory on the craft itself. With the unique paint job and the NCR logos emblazoned on the sides, Bear Force 1 otherwise seems like all the other Vertibirds. Bear Force 1 can be sabotaged in many ways to assassinate the NCR president, one of which is a nefarious update to the flight computer, which causes the Vertibird to crash into the dam on takeoff. This would substantiate the theory that many systems on these craft are automated due to the reduced visibility. So like I promised, let's take a look at the interior of this version again, because I have some concerns. It appears as if the entrance to the Vertibird is a door on the side, but on the interior there is no door, just a row of seats. Another problem is that the pilot's chairs, which are down from the transport bay, are sitting in recesses without much room on either side. How exactly do the pilots get into these chairs? Do they hop over the back of the chair? Step on the instrument panel? I genuinely can't think of a convenient way to get in and out of these chairs. Additionally, I'd always wondered what the ovals on the side of the Vertibirds are, and the interior doesn't really help much. It seems like a bunch of wasted space, although the window-looking part, which is not a window, looks like it has some wires running to this oval object, so it seems to be powered. I suppose it could be related to radar, some sort of antenna, or one of many systems that assist the pilots in flying this tin can. I also think it's funny to watch the pilots, who don't seem to be doing much. And maybe again, this is because the craft is flying itself. Vertibirds can be seen dropping mini nuke bombs, and that bomb bay must be under the cargo area, which might make sense because the cargo bay is elevated above the pilots, leaving a large portion of the craft unaccounted for. The landing gear is certainly stowed away in the bottom, but from looking at the interior, there doesn't seem to be any other good way to drop bombs if there is no bomb bay. I guess some unlucky guy could just chuck them out the door or something. I want to draw some attention to the concept art from Fallout 3, which is really interesting. It is obvious that the early concepts were leaning heavily into the dragonfly look, even giving it some front legs. The pilots look like they are on opposite sides in their respective eye bubbles. Some of the concepts seem to show smaller rotors that are within a housing. One thing that I think is actually really cool are the arm-like landing gear that look like they were intended to allow the Vertibird to land on uneven ground or even cling or adhere to ruins, akin to a dragonfly that can land on all sorts of surfaces, rather than an aircraft that needs a relatively flat area to land. Some of the pilots are shown to almost be in some sort of spacesuit, which would only be necessary if they are intended to fly at extreme heights. Some of these drawings make the Vertibirds look really menacing, which I have to applaud because I never knew dragonflies could be so menacing. That brings us to looking at the Vertibirds in Fallout 4 and Fallout 76, which is the larger, unnamed variant that seems to be the first of all Vertibird versions. There are many differences in how it looks, as well as the functionality. Being very obviously larger than the XVB-02, it also has conventional glass windshields and canopies, similar to the larger transport version seen in Fallout 2. It has 2 turbofan engines, a reconfigured landing gear arrangement, and large sliding doors that allow easy egress for even power-armored individuals. The last very interesting addition is a hidden hook on top that is usually only seen when a Brotherhood of Steel Vertibird docks with the Prydwen. The hook extends and latches onto a boom arm on the Prydwen that moves the Vertibird in to dock safely. Additionally, the wings can fold to the side and the blades can also fold, taking up a lot less room. We know for a fact this is a pre-war design since there are crashed Vertibirds that are mentioned to have crashed on or near the time of the Great War, like the ones seen in Concord, as well as being the only version seen in all of Fallout 76. This version lost its articulating Gatling laser, but now has a door gunner position seen in many military helicopters and made famous with Hueys during the Vietnam War. The design no longer has the dragonfly look. Instead, it is described in the Fallout 4 concept art book as being a mix between a goldfish and a hind helicopter. That is quite the mashup, I must say. and if I squint, I can kinda see the goldfish, but the hind inspiration can be seen with the circular and bubble-like canopy. The interior makes more sense than the XVB02, although there seems to be a lot of unused closed-off space that concept art seems to show was meant to be used for more cargo space. There are only 2 fixed forward-facing machine guns rather than the gimbal-mounted Gatling laser, and NPCs or the player can use the door minigun, which has endless ammo. The minigun is also much more powerful, since manning it grants the player a hidden perk that improves the damage of the weapon. The Brotherhood of Steel will attack enemies in the wasteland with the onboard weapons, as well as dropping off knights to engage enemies on the ground. The Brotherhood is not the only group with vertibirds, however. The Gunners are known to have one functional vertibird and had another one that was apparently crashed. The Minutemen will also get a hold of a few vertibirds if the game ends in their favor, so this version of Vertibird appears to be much more accessible than previous versions. The biggest change, however, is quite explosive. That is to say that vertibirds in Fallout 4, despite being armored attack and transport craft, are laughably easy to take down in Fallout 4. It is basically a rite of passage at this point to just be running around Boston or in a conversation with someone, only to be interrupted by a crashing and exploding vertibird. That seems like a great vehicle to base 90% of your logistics on right there, Maxim boy. Fallout 76 has the same exact vertibirds in Fallout 4, many of which are found crashed. Many of the crashed vertibirds are found with Brotherhood of Steel markings, meaning that the Brotherhood was actively taking advantage of and using vertibirds right after the Great War in the Appalachian region. Maybe there is a link between the Appalachian Brotherhood's use of this model of vertibird and the Fallout 4 Brotherhood's preference for them. The recent 76 expansion, the Pitt, has the player fly to the pit in a vertibird that looks mostly like the Fallout 4 version, but appears to be even bigger with more interior space. The cockpit area is massive, much bigger than in Fallout 4, although it does have the same overall shape. Similarly, the cargo bay is much bigger as well, with seating reminiscent of the Fallout 3 and New Vegas model vertibird. This may be a cargo version of the more common version we see in Fallout 4, similar to how there seems to be an assault and cargo version of the Enclave vertibirds. We even learned that this specific vertibird is powered by an ultracell, which is an energy-dense battery that utilizes the mineral ultracite that is mined in Appalachia. This means that this unique vertibird in Fallout 76 is electrical powered, and dialogue from an NPC named Orlando in Fallout 76 seems to suggest that all vertibirds are electrically powered, as he mentions that the ultracells are given as an alternate way to fuel the vertibird. This statement could imply an alternate kind of fuel, but I find that unlikely since the entire vertibird would need to be refitted in order to use a completely different kind of fuel. So, are we done with vertibirds yet? Nope. I think it is worth mentioning that collectively, all the vertibirds do not appear to use nuclear fuel or propulsion. I base this mainly off the fact that when they explode, there are no rads detected if you are close to the explosion, unlike any other nuclear-based explosion found in either Fallout 3 or Fallout 4. 76 seems to imply that they're electrically powered, but if you have some good evidence for or against either of these fuel sources, let's hear it in the comments. The very ambiguously named fighter jet is an aircraft that is only seen in Fallout 3 and New Vegas, but mostly 3. Most of them can be found on the decks of the defunct carrier turned city, Rivet City, where they are scattered about. The design should be familiar to anyone with a passing interest in aircraft. It is a direct copy of the P-80 or F-80. Seriously, take a look and there's almost nothing out of place. There are, however, a few notable differences, like the fact that the fighters found on the aircraft carrier seem to be naval versions because they have foldable wings, a feature that was notably absent from the real-life versions because they were not carrier-based craft. The fighters appear to have large wingtip fuel tanks and 650 caliber machine guns on the nose. There do not appear to be any hard points or launch rails on the wings or body of the aircraft, so it appears that the only viable option for engaging other enemy fighters was with machine guns, no air-to-air missiles. The aircraft can be seen crashed in Point Lookout, where a fixed-wing version is seen rather than the folding kind at Rivet City. This crash has an interesting story where it crashed on the day of the Great War, and according to a holotape from the Black Box, this was the result of running out of fuel when they could no longer communicate with ground control. The pilot ejected but was caught in the trees and killed by locals in the area. An attempt by a soldier from the Turtle Dove detention camp traveled to the crash to retrieve the black box, but he too was attacked by the locals and killed. This story seems to indicate a few things. One, that the fuel is likely to be some sort of conventional combustible fuel. And two, that the locals in Point Lookout were already completely bonkers and hyper-violent. They were just killing everyone over there. Several more can be found at Adams Air Force Base in the Broken Steel add-on, which makes sense, but another one is found in Fallout New Vegas and is suspended from the ceiling inside Camp McCarran, so it is technically in New Vegas as well. So let's talk about this glaring issue with the fighter jet being in Fallout 3. Namely that this is a game taking place in 2277, with technology that had advanced up to the year 2077. The P-80 Shooting Star was one of the first jet-powered fighters fielded by the United States. So why is that exact airplane found all over Fallout 3? This isn't a design inspired by the Shooting Star, this is the Shooting Star. Why is a plane that is over 100 years old found on an aircraft carrier, an airbase, and crashed into a Point Lookout bog? Here is the most probable explanation, and a disclaimer that this is not lore, this is RadKing speculation and headcanon. Rivet City was a dry docked aircraft carrier, and if we look at the approximate location of Rivet City and compare it to a real map of DC, Rivet City would be very close to the US Navy Museum, that in our day does have some large ships docked close by in the Anacostia River. If the carrier was part of this museum, then those fighter jets could be part of the museum display, rather than representing actual fighting aircraft. There is a precedent for this, like the USS Midway in San Diego that is a large exhibit that showcases a bunch of aircraft on the flight deck that are older and no longer in use. But what about the examples at Adams Air Force Base, or the crashed one in Point Lookout? Well, this may be explained if the US was using updated shooting stars to train new pilots. Older planes that are easy to fly and maintain are good candidates for training aircraft, and if the US kept updated versions of the Shooting Star because, 1950s and all, that plus a resource crunch as a result of the war could explain why this plane was being flown on the day of the Great War, as well as why a few can be found at Adams Air Force Base. Otherwise, I can't make sense of its presence and why it is in the game in its current state. If any of you have any other explanation, I'd love to hear it. First seen in Fallout 4, the creatively named Jetliner is a massive airliner that can be found crashed and broken up in many places, as well as in Fallout 76. It is a massive aircraft that is never seen in-game in its undamaged state, but there are some pretty good examples to understand the scale and look of the aircraft. This airliner is unique for a few reasons, mainly due to the passenger seating, which extended out into the wings, where the leading edge of the wing actually had glass for passengers to look out of. They had 8 or 10 engines that were located farther out on the wings and in a large cluster. And lastly, those engines are nuclear, baby. The fact that the wing space has room for people rather than the usual fuel required by modern day turbine engines is one indication. But the smoking gun is that when you get close to the engines, you pick up rads. Those sweet warm rads. The design is very cool, and if we cheat and look at some complete models, we can see the entire thing a little better. A blended wing design, so no well-defined fuselage like we see with modern airliners, but not a complete flying wing design like the B-2. There are some interesting historical craft somewhat similar to the design philosophy of the airliner. The Kalinin 7 was a one-off Soviet plane built in the 1930s, was to become a heavy bomber, but also had plans for a passenger variant that would put seats in the wings, which were up to 7 feet thick. The idea for a nuclear-powered jet was a fantasy of the 1950s and 60s, so a working nuclear airliner fits right in with what we expect Fallout technology to try and emulate. Magazine covers, like the Popular Mechanics April 1957 edition, shows the hopes of the times for atomic transportation. The problems with nuclear engines are plentiful though, as I'm sure you can imagine, but here are the main points. Direct cycle engines were more powerful and provided the best performance results, but the exhaust was radioactive, which is a problem for most people who don't want to be constantly irradiated by passing planes. The indirect cycle engines kept radioactive material contained, but were far less powerful. Crashing and other catastrophic failures would be particularly dangerous due to the presence of so much radioactive material. And lastly, designers could not create adequate shielding that would keep the crew from receiving dangerous doses of radiation. In Fallout, these problems were either fixed or completely disregarded, since we know that the safety standards in Fallout are enough to make OSHA crap their pants. Hull wrecks or parts of airliners are found all over Fallout 4 and Fallout 76, with markings indicating the airlines that they flew for, which were mostly Skylines Air and Horizon Airlines. It seems that some of these crashed due to damage from nuclear blasts themselves, like Skylane's Flight 1981, and it's possible others could have crashed due to complications related to EMPs from nuclear detonation or the lack of communications with ground control. Interestingly, the Skylane's Flight 1981 had a secret compartment that can be lockpicked, where a number of contraband items like chems, ammo, and weapons can be looted, so there were some nefarious dealings going on with some of the crew. The cargo plane is so named because of a reference in the Fallout New Vegas official game guide, and is found in several places, usually crashed. The design inspiration looks the closest to the C-47 Skytrain, just looking at the plane as a whole. There are some differences, however, namely an additional intake of some sort that is seen close to the engines on both wings, and the ability for the wings to fold like what can be seen at Camp McCarran. I was not able to find any real-life variant of the C-47 that had folding wings, but folding wings seems to be a very popular feature for Fallout aircraft. The additional intake on the outside of the engine is somewhat mysterious, as it does not obviously feed a smaller engine, so maybe it provides more air to the existing prop engine. 8 examples can be found at Camp McCarran, 1 crashed near the Nipton Road pit stop, and 1 crashed example in Zion Canyon. With how similar it is to the C-47, it makes me wonder if this is an example of updating an existing platform in order to get more use out of it. The BT-67 is exactly that in our world, an updated version of the C-47 to allow it to be used in modern-day air forces. So maybe this cargo plane is a similar updated version of an existing platform. In the depths of Lake Mead lies a monster that helped mark the end of World War II, a beautiful, deteriorated, and soggy B-29. The B-29 hardly needs any introduction and is personally one of my favorite World War II aircraft designs. The only example in Fallout is found at the bottom of Lake Mead as a nod to the real-life incident when a B-29 crashed into the lake. A B-29 that was stripped of armaments to be remade into a reconnaissance aircraft was flying at very low altitude over Lake Mead. Due to a faulty altimeter and glare reflecting off the lake's surface, the pilot misjudged his altitude and continued to descend until he hit the water. The plane skipped along the water, had 4 of its engines ripped off, and started on fire, although all crew members survived. The incident was classified for a while, but has since been registered as a historical site. The boomers at Nellis are aware of this plane and ask the player to attach large inflation balloons to float the craft so it can be recovered. In Fallout, it appears to have crashed in a much shallower area of the lake, and also has all of its engines intact, as well as its machine guns in place, unlike the real-life version. The boomers will go on to restore the aircraft with B-29 parts that are found at Nellis and can assist the player at the Battle of Hoover Dam by doing a bombing run. While I love the ending with a bombing run, thinking of how the boomers could possibly restore an airframe that has been submerged for over 300 years is an impossible task. I think I would have preferred a scenario where the boomers had the parts, but no way to know how it all fit together. And instead of restoring an existing airframe, they just needed it as a reference to know how to build a new one using all their spare parts. That's just a nitpick though, since I like the boomers and the quest to raise the plane is just fine. Another wonderfully named aircraft, the Jetliner, is a plane found in Fallout New Vegas. This peculiar aircraft is found in many places, including the Searchlight Airport, Camp McCarran, and Jean's Skydiving. Like I explained in my first video, which, whatever you do, please don't go watch that one. I sound like I haven't gone through puberty yet. This is a design called a channel wing. Normally planes get air to flow over and under the wing by pushing the plane forward through the air. That's pretty simple. The mechanics behind a channel wing is to use the engine to push the plane forward, yes, but also to directly draw air over the wing. When done correctly, this can lead to much lower takeoff speeds because the lift force is much higher with the engine actively drawing air across the wing. I think the plane has visual similarities to the Custer CCW-5, namely the intake, although it is notable that the New Vegas version has a turbofan engine and not a prop engine. The only problem with using a jet engine though is that the air will not be routed over the channel portion of the wing. It will just be sucked up into the intake and exhausted out the back, completely bypassing the channel, which defeats the entire purpose of the channel wing. I like the inclusion of a plane with this design, since it was first concepted in the 40s, with some functional aircraft being built in the 50s and 60s, exactly the time period Fallout's pre-war emulates. A small interesting tidbit is that the editor ID is called NV Small Prop Plane 01, but it is very obviously not a prop plane. Chinese planes are uncommon in Fallout, but we can see some of them in the Operation Anchorage DLC. They are seen flying high in the sky and can't be interacted with, but using the power of technology, we can get a better look at them. Alright, they're not flying that high in the sky, and they're kinda tiny. It is an interesting twin boom design. That is to say that there are two fuselages that are married by a very large wing in the front and horizontal stabilizer in the back. There appear to be two cockpits with bubble-shaped canopies, although this could easily be an arrangement where pilots and co-pilots are in one and support crewmen are in the other. That twin boom design is again reminiscent of the aforementioned Kalinin K7, but with a wing-shaped design close to something like the Junkers Ju-322, which was conceptualized as a wooden glider. I think this design is pretty cool, and I like to see sparring design philosophies between China and the US. First introduced in Fallout 4, the very unique looking Stingray Deluxe is usually seen first outside of the ArcJet systems as a display. They can also be found crashed in many places or on display in the Vim Pop factory. Looking at the design, this thing is pretty wild and has a joined wing design, which is why it looks like it has stacked wings. The V-shaped tail, winglets, and other stabilizers near the fuselage are all part of a blended wing design that altogether looks like the animal it takes its name from, a stingray. The aircraft is jet powered, but we have no idea if it's a conventional turbofan or if it's nuclear powered. Although since this is such an original design, I would put my caps on nuclear powered. Although the concept art of Fallout 4 book shows the Stingray under the title Private Jet, the Stingray is also seen on a cover of the Tesla magazine as a military aircraft, as well as on the Museum of History mural. The Museum of History mural also seems to imply that the Stingray Deluxe is capable of spaceflight, but this might be wrong since the mural seamlessly transitions between different periods of time. If it is capable of spaceflight, I would expect to see either forward-facing engines to slow down in the vacuum of space, or smaller thrusters along the body that would allow for the craft to orient itself, something conventional aircraft control surfaces can't do without air. The magazine cover implies that it can be armed with machine guns, rocket pods, and missiles, so we are left to wonder if this was the active fighter in the US Air Force at the time of the Great War. We also assume it was created by ArcJet Systems, since it is outside the ArcJet headquarters in Fallout 4, although that is not explicitly stated anywhere. The Stingray is also seen in Fallout 76 on display in places like the Hornwright Estate and at the Wade Airport, although no military versions are ever seen. I think the fact that we see these non-military versions in the world would indicate that it is not the go-to fighter for the US, since the government usually has a lot of control over its military contractors, and they aren't very keen on letting civilians getting their hands on new technology. That is, unless the design is actually older and no longer an active warplane, in which case civilians can get their grubby little hands on phased out and decommissioned war vehicles. The Prydwen is the pride and joy of the East Coast Brotherhood of Steel at the time Fallout 4 takes place, but airships have a history with the Brotherhood. They use them to travel across the continent in Fallout Tactics, being taken out of the sky by a large storm around Chicago. The Prydwen is an impressive craft, held aloft by hydrogen and some rather large thruster engines. It was made over the course of 6 years after defeating the Enclave at Adams Air Force Base, using salvaged materials. This 40,000-ton airship is capable of docking Vertibirds and appears to carry enough supplies, munitions, and gear to invade any area and gain a foothold. We get some good information from the Art of Fallout, where the design was said to be a diesel punk design that incorporates elements of zeppelins and naval vessels. A real-world inspiration for this setup would be the USS Akron, which was an airship designed to carry small fighter planes, that also had mechanisms for recovering them while in air. It is stated to use mysterious technologies in addition to the hydrogen to keep it afloat, which makes sense since the largest airship ever constructed was only 1,235 tons. Compare that to the 40,000 tons in the Prydwen, and that is absolutely asinine. In my original video, I incorrectly tried to delineate between Zeppelin, dirigibles, and blimps. A lighter than air airship that can steer is a dirigible, which is what the Prydwen would be considered. The Prydwen gets its name from the legendary King Arthur, who had a ship called the Prydwen, but this detail is only from Welsh literature. Obviously, there's an interesting connection there with Arthur Maxon, the Brotherhood's elder. Could Bethesda be setting him up to become a mythological figure within the Brotherhood? How about some aircraft that were either forgotten about in my first video or have since been added? It has been a few years after all. The awesomely named Hellion was an experimental pre-war craft found in Fallout Tactics. The craft was a prototype weapon in the pre-war that was meant to be completed by the calculator, and as such was hidden away in the bowels of Buena Vista. The plan was the calculator could get the aircraft operational and then use it in its directive to protect Vault Zero. The design is very futuristic, not the retro-futuristic designs that we are used to seeing in Fallout. It is nuclear powered, since it is stated that it has an active and working reactor on board, has vertical takeoff capabilities, and could fly at speeds in excess of 400 miles per hour, which is surprisingly slow. It is said to use JP-5 fuel and able to fly for 8 hours. What is JP-5 nuclear fuel? I have no idea, but it sounds pretty official. We don't get a great look at the craft, but if you can spot similarities to other sci-fi aircraft, please leave a comment. Fallout 76 has a plane not seen in any other game that we will just refer to as the Biplane because the in-game name of PT-00D sucks. It is found all over Appalachia and in a variety of color schemes, with the fuselage being red, green, blue, or yellow. Interestingly, it has markings or roundels on the wing for the US Army Air Corps, which was the name of the Air Force before it became its own branch of the military and was still under the auspices of the Army. If those markings are legitimate, that would make these planes extremely old, and the plane even has some information written on the side that instructs the users to use aviation gasoline with an octane rating of 73. It is visually similar to the Boeing Stearman Model 75 biplane, which was used as a training plane from the 30s up until the end of World War II. Having so many older biplanes in Appalachia is not that weird though, because light aircraft have been commonly used to treat crops with pesticides. The sheer number of this particular aircraft is itself interesting. People seem to really like this plane, but most interesting are these Army Air Corps markings. It is hard to believe that they are all real and legitimate, and there is a distinct chance that most of those markings were placed because people like them, which strictly speaking is legal in the US. The other interesting thing is the fact that it obviously takes conventional fuel, which we know was exceptionally sparse in the latter 2000s, and if we didn't see so many crashed aircraft all over the place, we could assume that people no longer flew them because it was just too expensive. But we do see many crashed examples, meaning that many of them were flying. So what gives here? It would be really cool to see something that indicated that people were somehow fueling these with some sort of moonshine homebrew fuel. Part of the automation craze of Appalachia meant that even aircraft got in on the action. Cargobots were developed by the US government in the 2060s in order to deliver supplies in wartime. The National Catastrophe Relief Auxiliary had some of these Cargobots and set them up to deliver aid in the event of a catastrophe, although this seems to be limited to the Appalachian region only. The system is still functional, and a Cargobot can be summoned by broadcasting a US supply requisition holotape at a broadcast tower. These unarmed crafts have 4 articulating boosters and a claw machine-like component that can grab and drop supplies. There are 4 eyes, for lack of a better term, on each corner of the cube-like body that looks similar to Mr. Handy's. There are 3 variants: the normal version, the Recon Cargobot, and a crashed Artcos Pharma one that is distinguishable due to its blue and white color. The Cargobots were initially called Vertibots and were meant to have propellers as well. And I don't know about you, but when I look at the concept art, they look kind of cute. One automated craft in Fallout 76 was not enough, so we got the Vertibot. Yes, I know the Cargobot was going to be called a Vertibot, but with a nice little switcheroo, Vertibots are essentially automated Vertibirds. They are identical to normal Vertibirds except for having opaque windows and inaccessible doors. They are often seen guarding Cargobots or doing reconnaissance missions, and can be called to assist players who have Vertibot signal grenades. They pack a punch and have a good amount of armor and health, very much unlike the Fallout 4 Vertibirds. These Vertibots are the reason why I think all Vertibirds may have advanced levels of automation, which would help those poor pilots in the Fallout 3 style Vertibirds fly with only a slit to look out of. There are a number of aircraft that are mentioned in passing or seen rarely in the game that I want to mention here. The P-51 only appears in Fallout 3, hanging as an exhibit piece in the Museum of Technology and the Capitol Preservation Society in Rivet City. A Lockheed L-1011 TriStar can be seen in pieces around Megaton, with a very prominent chunk of the cockpit resting rather precariously on the roof of Craterside Supply. Random other pieces are seen around Megaton that are assumed to belong to this airplane. The Wright Flyer, the very first powered flight vehicle, was stored in the Museum of Technology and has been heavily damaged from war and neglect. I sure hope that's a replica. In Fallout Tactics, there are a number of helicopters that can be seen in various states of disrepair. In fact, there are more helicopters in Tactics than all the other games combined. The design is a 1-for-1 match with Hueys, which falls in line with this game's slightly different design philosophy. A supersonic airliner is mentioned again at the Museum of Technology and was to be displayed at the museum before the Great War ended Fallout's attempt at its own Concorde. Lastly, a Chinese fighter, the Xian-85, is mentioned by boomers in Fallout New Vegas, who trained to fly using virtual reality simulators at the base. One boomer, Pitt, claims to have shot down over 500 of these in the Visiontron simulation lounges, although unfortunately the player cannot see these fighters for themselves. Xian is a name that has been used by a few cargo aircraft developed by China in the real world. You did it. You made it. Whether you did it in one playthrough or a few, it doesn't matter. You persevered and heard the word of Adam, so you will receive his blessings. If you want to answer Adam's call for even greater blessings, he admonishes you to check out my Discord, link in the description. You can also consider becoming a patron, like these beautiful people here, so I can continue to cover any and all Fallout content. All proceeds go straight to Adam, through the miracle of division, so don't worry. Let's move on to the comment highlights of my Energy Weapons Part 2 video, and video about the Wasteland's best leader, Dave. In the Dave video, some of you mentioned that you would like to see an Easter egg or nod to Dave in a future game, and I have to agree. Some of you even wanted it to go full Shady Sands and have the Republic of Dave become the next big thing on the East Coast. I'm glad so many of you see what a great leader Dave is. One of you mentioned that Dave has become Fallout's Chuck Norris meme, and after reading so many comments, I have to agree. We need to make this a thing. Honestly, I just found myself laughing like an idiot at so many things that you all said, so thank you for your great senses of humor. In my Energy Weapons video, Bork's channel made this interesting comment where he liked to think that the different alien weapon designs was due to different factions of Zetans, and the more I think about it, the more I like this idea. If there were competing groups of Zetans interested in the Earth, it would make for a much more interesting story than some sort of monolithic group. As to what they would be vying for, that would remain to be seen. Blue had my favorite comment relating to Elijah's jury-rigged cannon, and this is my personal headcanon. The basics are that, despite what the name implies, it was not entirely made by Elijah, but his modifications on the existing beaten prototype. That just makes so much more sense to me than him coming up with an identical weapon to the beaten prototype whole cloth. Zygarde mentioned Command & Conquer, and that is a road straight to my heart. I love those games, and I find myself thinking a lot of crossovers between the two franchises. Time for a Fallout Red Alert mashup. I got a good laugh out of Love Cake's comment where it was theorized that the aliens gambled away their alien blasters in Fallout New Vegas and therefore had to settle for laser pistols instead. Those aliens need to learn the hard way that the house always wins. Just Another Account had a really interesting comment saying that the Tesla coil recovered for the Brotherhood looks more like a cavity magnetron, a device used to generate microwaves. That is a great connection, and like they said in the comment, if there is indeed some sort of beam used to create a conductive path for electricity, it could be created from this magnetron, and would therefore be using a maser that is basically a microwave laser instead of a conventional laser. few of you caught a reference that I did not when talking about the Fallout Brotherhood of Steel 2 Tesla cannon. One required element was an unlicensed nuclear reactor, which I thought was strange because it was so specific. But this is a reference to Ghostbusters, where their proton packs are powered by unlicensed nuclear reactors. That makes so much more sense, and I am much happier now. That is it, my faithful brothers and sisters. But don't worry, since I have a weekly video goal, so you'll be able to watch as much as you want. Let Adam's wisdom guide you. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you at our next gathering.